Thank you so much, Professor Ebrahim Musa. Yeah, it is. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, yeah. I've always admired of your ability to break down these things to the small details, at the same time keeping in mind the bigger picture of all that, the Taj Mahal picture, or Mona Lisa, you used to call it before. While you were speaking, several examples also came to my mind, since you often illustrate your speech with examples. So I thought of several examples too, and they also pertinent to one of the points that you made in some of your speeches or books about that. At the early times of Islam, several traditions, certain traditions and customs, they were simply legalized by the appearance of Islam. Islam asserted their right for existence, but it doesn't mean that these traditions, they should remain unchanged. And you see in the modern world what we observe. Recently I noticed that it also caused the reaction among Malaysians, that in Russia a Muslim woman decided to challenge President Putin in the next elections, which are going to be held in 2018. And the woman is coming from quite conservative, traditional region of Dagestan, or Dagestan as Iranians would tell us about it. So when I was reading the reactions to that, because I've noticed in Malaysia people are excited about it, and they're saying like, oh, and how do you look at it? What's going to happen to it? We're not excited. She's not going to succeed. And she herself said, I'm not going to succeed. I know that I don't have a chance, but it's my way to assert the position of women in our society. And I'm sure she speaks possibly not about the society of that secular country in a whole, but she speaks about that Muslim society that she's coming from Dagestan, very conservative one. But she received a whole lot of comments from Muslim women from Caucasus region about that. So we get Islam, we Muslim women, and you preach, you teach us that we should see it at home, as Islam teaches us. But you, as a public figure, you have the right to go out there and speak publicly and be a public person. So where's the rationale here? And this we're speaking about the country which is secular by the constitution and by the convictions of the majority of people. Then we have another example. We have Pakistan, a very traditional country, a very patriarchal country, but at the same time which somehow managed to find a way to praise its female Muslim leaders. Like now we see Maryam and Kulsum Nawaz, they are participating in politics very actively, although they still carry the name, and even in the press when you see Maryam Nawaz Sharif, Kulsum Nawaz, they carry the name of their father and their husband, but they're still very active and the society praises them. Or I'm not speaking of the late Benazir Bhutta, who also was, if I'm not mistaken, coming from Shia Muslim family. So by the different phases of how it is being put into practice in different societies, like you see such a patriarchy in quite secular society, and some outburst of, we can say, secularism or feminism in a very patriarchal traditional society. By this we can see that it was not Islam which was teaching patriarchy in the first place. But what we failed to do is to actually reflect on it, to think of it. What came first, and should it really be questioned? I leave it at here, and I'm very delighted to pass the microphone to Professor Mohamed El-Tahir El-Mesawi, who is a professor at the Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. Professor El-Mesawi has been working there since 1994. He obtained his PhD from the Department of Usuluddin and Comparative Religion from the same university. And he holds master's degree from the same university and bachelor's degree in economics from Rahman Islamic University, Sudan. Professor El-Mesawi also authored a large number of articles and books, which include, among others, A Muslim Theory of Human Society, The Question of Ideas in the Muslim World, and also the Maqasid al-Sharia. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone to Professor.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Let me first of all thank the organizers of this event for giving me the opportunity to be amongst you here with our dear colleague and friend, Professor Ebrahim, Musa. And actually, when Dr. Farouk called me about 6 to 7 days ago and informed me about this event, I was actually hesitating whether to accept the invitation or not, because the time for me was short in order to prepare something systematic. And especially we are here with a great scholar. I have been reading his works and I have actually learned a lot from Prof. Ibrahim's works. What made me decide to come was to come and listen to him. Because actually this is the first time I meet him, although we communicated maybe once or twice through email, but physically and spiritually I have been with him, and intellectually, but physically it's the first time I meet Prof. Ibrahim. So with those remarks, which are a kind of excuse to me, or just to find a way out of my feeling that I'll not be able really to provide something that will be of much interest to the good audience here, but at least I will try to interact one way or the other with what Prof. Ibrahim has been saying, not just by commenting on what he has submitted, but I'll try to throw out some remarks, some observations from what I have been reflecting on and from my personal experience in following the journey of Islamic thought when reflecting on issues of Islah and Tajdeed. And let me start from where he started. It's good he mentioned at the beginning the famous hadith, which has been at the center of much debate on Islah and Tajdeed, especially Tajdeed, and books have been written about it. And whether the Mujaddid is one individual or rather a community of individuals, whether it's only the scholars or thinkers or all types of influential people can bring about tajdeed in the life of the Muslim community in all its dimensions. Here I remember one of the prominent scholars of the school of Islah and Tajdeed of Abdu Afghani and others, the late Sheikh of Zaytuna Mosque University of Tunisia, Mohamed El-Tahir ibn Ashur. Most probably, at least some of you have heard about him, especially through his famous book on Maqasid al-Sharia, which Prof. Ibrahim referred to a while ago. In the 40s, he wrote a series of articles just commenting on that hadith. And the crux of what he presented in his comment, he took his Muslim history century by century until the 12th or 13th century. And the main lesson of what he wrote, which amounted to a whole book actually, is more than 100 pages, perhaps 150 pages, that the issue of Tajdeed Islah is not an individual personal matter. It's a collective endeavor. It's a collective endeavor. It's also a holistic approach. So, because whenever there is something wrong in one aspect of our lives, of our community life, of our experiences, it's not actually isolated from other aspects and dimensions of a human life. But of course, there are certain aspects that are given priority to others. And of course, as a scholar who was devoted to Islamic scholarship, who was advocating ijtihad, and who was reflecting on the previous experience of Muslims throughout the ages, his inclination or his preference was that the main seat of reform, or say the basis for reform in all aspects, should be education. Because it is in educational institutions where knowledge is produced and profused and disseminated. It's there that minds are being shaped. The thinking of people should be built within educational institutions. And this preference of his is well explained, can be well explained by the fact that his earlier work, first book which he wrote while still a fresh graduate, somewhere in 1905 to 1910, was about the reform of Islamic education, but he did not speak about the reform of that education in the abstract. He tried to give a kind of historical analysis of how Muslim education developed over the centuries in its major cities or its major centers of education, from Baghdad, from the Medina in early time, to Damascus, to Andalusia, to the different places that have been known, at least as far as he was able to write history of Islamic education, that were the major centers where Muslim knowledge or Islamic knowledge developed and was spread. Of course, later on, this issue of reforming education has been touched upon and actually dealt with sometimes at quite extensive level by different people. Muhammad Iqbal is one of those who dealt in somewhat with education. But we find Fadl al-Rahman, we find others who talked about education. And now different, some schools even appeared that try to advocate the reform of Muslim education. And in that context, Ibn Ashur was lamenting from the status of his own days within the Zaytuna University, within the circles of scholars, that some of his contemporaries, he was saying, you see them living with you in the 14th century, referring to the 14th century, the Hijri 14th century, but it's just a matter of short time. When you approach them and see them, you find them living somewhere in the 9th or in the 8th century, meaning that they were not actually in touch with the contemporary world, with its problems, with its challenges, with its novelties, whatever happening in that world. And for him, reforming Islamic education was not just to write or reintroduce Islamic knowledge with a new type of style, linguistic style, to make it perhaps easier to comprehend by people whose relations with standard Arabic are quite loose, poor, but how to revive the central issue of making those learners, those people who study, think about what they study. Not only that, he was thinking that we should have our education in such a way that it will be comprehensive. It's not just a matter of teaching whatever Islamic disciplines we have had. Some of those disciplines might be irrelevant for today's problems and challenges. But he said that how to incorporate whatever new knowledge has come up in the modern world, but subject it to the lens of our values. How to make such knowledge relevant to the values we have. And within that line of thinking, he thought that it would be useful to provide some kind of general framework. Because education is not for its own sake. Knowledge is not for its own sake. It is how to make society better, how to make the life of the people better. And at the center of that, there should be certain core values that wherever we are doing education or doing politics or doing economics or doing this or that, whatever field we are dealing with, whatever endeavor we are doing, we need to be sure of the core values that should guide us and for which we should struggle in order to translate them into our life, because these are the landmarks that will determine or should determine, according to him, our movement in the contemporary world. And for this, he, at the same time, was working on two important books. One is Maqasid al-Sharia, and he related what he was doing in this book to facing up to the challenges that are now in the lives of Muslims, as communities, not just as individuals, because his most concern was about how to make the Muslim community relive its values or retranslate the eternal values of Islam in the context of the contemporary world. And in that book, he was quite innovative. He did not just reproduce what previous scholars had said about Maqasid al-Sharia, the grand or the objectives of the Sharia. He tried to relevantize, if I may say, or establish the relevance of Maqasid al-Sharia to the concerns of the contemporary world. Certain values that have become the watch cry in our contemporary world, like freedom, like equality, justice, etc. Of course, these are there in the texts, and they are dealt with in different ways. But as Prof. Ebrahim was saying, the bigger picture, the larger picture, how to make whatever has been dispersed in the different books of jurisprudence, of manuals, compendia, etc., how to bring all this as a system or a scale of values. And That's the important contribution of Ibn Ashur to Islah, that we need first to know what are the central values around which our efforts as society, as individuals, as institutions, in the different fields of life should constitute the frame of reference. Because without these values that are the standards we should strive to attain in order to make our lives better, our conditions better, we will actually be moving around in all directions, and in the end we cannot achieve anything. This was the first aspect of his reformative approach. And why I am saying this, relating is why I have started with education, because actually he was teaching those values. The book which is published and the Maqasid al-Sharia was actually what he was teaching in that institution, the Zaytuna Grand Mosque, because none of the other scholars touched that. They were just repeating, reproducing whatever texts that have been produced by early scholars without trying to make the relevance or establish the relevance of those teachings to the present situation. But this set of values, of course I'm not going to tell you about, because he talked about the famous that we find in Al-Ghazali, Juwayni, Amidi, Razi, etc., and of course mainly Ash-Shatibi. Of course we find similar things expressed in different ways in Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi, especially in his book, The Conclusive Argument from God, or Hujjatullah al-Baligha. But Ibn Ashur was quite aware that now, especially, should remember that he was engaging in this process of thought when the general umbrella that was shadowing the Muslims as an ummah, the caliphate, has already gone. So what I may call the general framework of the community has been fragmented or has been disintegrated. So there is no umbrella that can actually unite the Muslims as a community. Now they are being separated into different nationalities, into different nation states, etc., etc. Of course, at that time, most of them, if not all, were under the colonial occupation. So he was aware of that we are actually in a very big historical gap. We no more have that kind of umbrella. So that umbrella, or that ground on which Muslims as a community would stand, has already been undermined, has been already actually eroded and destroyed. So for him, we need to identify what are the values, the core values that we should make as our reference. But these values need to be actualized and implemented or translated into practice within a socio-political framework. And this brought him to think about the issue of the state or governance. And at the same time, parallel to that, he was working on his other book about the foundations of Islamic socio-political system. Because such values that need to be strived for by the community or by the society can only be done within a certain framework. And it's amazing that within that context, and this was in the 30s and early 40s, he was doing this work. He was, if I am not mistaken, the first to devote some good attention to the issue of democracy. It was a new term, a new concept in the Muslim context. Perhaps one or two at that time have spoken about it. Iqbal, not in an extensive manner, and the Egyptian scholar Mahmoud Abbas al-Aqad, he wrote a pamphlet or a booklet about that. But it was just devoted to the issue of politics. But Sheikh Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur was trying to see the matter in a holistic manner, that society and the social system, the socio-political system, has to be dealt with in a comprehensive manner. There he also again reiterated the issue of justice, of tolerance, of compassion, and most important, he was talking about the human self. Because unfortunately, much thought has been produced, much talk is going on about reform, and we have actually been able, over the last 100 years, to establish institutions so beautiful, or at least to implant them. We just borrow them from whatever sources we have in front of us, especially from the Western experience, the European experience. Our universities, we have emulated the different models, whether it is a French model or American model or British model. But the individual in these institutional setups does not seem to have been given attention or due attention or what they. So we have very beautiful campuses. We have in many countries we have most advanced facilities, whether in religious or non-religious institutions. But we'll find that the end result, I just take one aspect. In innovation, in academic production, in intellectual production, we have not been able to produce excellent, outstanding scholars, whether in this or that. So where is the individual? Where is the islah of the individual? We produce very good constructs. We talk about very good things in fiqh. We talk about theology and philosophy and whatever. But where is the individual human being, the self, that actually is supposed to internalize these values and to translate these values and to stand up to the standard of those values? This is and when the test comes, you will find that whether the person is a graduate of a traditional Islamic university or a modern Islamic university or a modern secular, totally secular university, the end result is almost the same. Is almost the same. Some universities, I can just talk about my country, Tunisia. We have gone a long way in secularization, in marginalizing religious education, in even secularizing religious education. And our universities, I have been complaining to some of my colleagues over there in France, we have many social problems. And Tunisia, after 2011, after the so-called Arab Spring, and I think it should be called Arab Spring because at least Tunisia is still surviving to keep the torch there, although despite all odds. Tunisia has been singled among the countries from where a big number of young people joined ISIS. That has been news, news. And we have dozens and dozens of professors. Secular, some of them they are atheists, okay, from the Tunisian universities, in psychology, in anthropology, in sociology. But I have not come across a single reliable study done by these people. So what is this academia for? This university has been given all kinds of support. And the few studies that have been done on this phenomenon are done either by non-specialists, people who have not been trained to be a sociologist or a psychologist or anthropologist or whatever, or cultural studies, or by Europeans and Americans. So is it the problem just Islamic thought, or there is a total condition? I'm talking here from a specific experience. And this is the same in Algeria. This is the same in Egypt. We have gone a long way for trying to de-traditionalize our societies, desecularize our education, our family life. Tunisia is well known for its aggressive approach. But when I look what is there, I start thinking, is it just a matter of reforming religious thought or reforming whatever kind of culture and thought we have there? Because as far as I can see, and I can judge, religious thought is not actually guiding the society. It's not actually the thought that governs our societies. At least in Tunisia, in Algeria, Morocco, it's in Egypt, although we have Al-Azhar there, but it is not the scholars of Al-Azhar who actually devise the different policies, who plan for the country, who plan for the society, who plan for the general educational system from the primary to the tertiary levels. So that sometimes that's why I feel hesitating, and I feel not really at ease when we think of Islah or reform as just a matter of religious or Islamic aspect. With due respect to different approaches, but I find that the problem is actually more comprehensive and more complex than we try to do, because it has a lot of talk over the last few years has been going on about Islam, terrorism, Islam, dogmatism, Islam, this and that, Islam that. But let me just give you information. Most of the youth, the people from Tunisia, I have to talk about something which I know, who joined ISIS and go there become killers without hearts, a machine killing. Many of them, not less than 50 to 60%, according to certain studies, they did not have any religious education. They were the left outs of the modern schooling system established by Habib Bourguiba and promoted and enhanced by Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. Some of them they were drug traffickers. Some of them, they were guilty for different crimes and have spent some years or some time in the jail. And suddenly, out of nowhere, they turn into a kind of butchers. So can we explain that in terms of Islam and Islamic teachings? I have a big question about this. And many other things, many other phenomena that are going on in our... so it means there is a bigger machine, more impressive or more stronger forces that are there in one way or another to shape and manufacture, perhaps, many of the happenings that we are facing. So I have some apprehensions about looking at reform just as a matter within Islam and Islamic thought. Because, to me at least, Islam is not the governing authority. I mean, in government, not in terms of political authority, but in terms of the values, the frame of reference that is guiding the policies and the plans and the practices in many of our societies, in Tunisia in particular. Islam is not there. So is it really adequate to explain the thing in Islamic terms? I have a big question, and I think this just an addition. It's not, I'm not actually commenting, but I am adding something for consideration by the learned colleagues here and by the learned audience, hoping that that we need really rethink reform. So rethinking reform needs that we raise certain questions that our experiences in the recent time have shown that some premises and propositions actually need to be abandoned because they make us start from some wrong places. And of course, the analysis will be, of course, not as accurate and as adequate as it should be in a way that would lead us to really find the path of reform. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.